Hi, Bob.
Hi, Bob.
How are you?
I'm good. And you?
I'm excellent. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show. You are Robert Stickgold, an eminent sleep researcher, professor at Harvard Medical School. And we're going to talk about sleep and dreams and why we sleep and why we dream. And I'm a little concerned about this because my wife accuses me of not getting enough sleep, and I'm afraid that you may provide her with some ammunition because I know you've been known to warn about the perils of not sleeping enough, right? That's one of your sermons.
Yes. The sermon goes, if you don't sleep enough, you're going to end up fat, sick, and stupid.
Well, there are worse things.
Depressed.
There are worse things. But I'll take your counsel. I will contemplate your counsel after the end of this conversation. But your work does cut across a lot of interesting, questions having to do with not just with sleep, but with dreams. Why don't we start out with a very fundamental question, which is why do we sleep at all? This had actually never occurred to me until about 30 years ago. I was talking to a colleague and collaborator of yours, Alan Hobson, very well known in his own right. And he kind of famously said, what is the line? The only known function of
sleep is to cure sleeping.
Is to cure sleeping, right. And you have pointed out, I think, that's like saying the only function of eating is to cure hunger or something. I mean, right. Of course, there obviously are other functions of eating to get nutrients in you, and the hunger is just your body's way of getting you to do something that's good for you. But I guess Alan's point at that time, at least, was we don't really have a clue as to why people sleep at all. And it never occurred to me because it does seem commonsensical to us that, you sleep to rest, right? But of course, we didn't have to be designed that way. And so do we have a clear answer now as to why human beings are designed by evolution to sleep?
So all mammals, all animals, as far as we can tell, sleep.
Okay.
I mean, fruit flies sleep in their own way. You can't measure it the same way because they don't have brains like we do, but you see these periods of rest which come at the same time every day, and if you keep them in continuous light, they only sleep at what would have been their bedtime, and if you sleep deprive them, they make it up. So all of that looks like it's the same thing. And I think the best explanation for why sleep evolved, which is the question you're asking, is that it turns out in the case of humans that for every 2 hours we spend awake taking in new information, the brain basically has to go offline for an hour to figure out what the hell it all means. It's very easy to get a computer to record my visual image, to record my voice. I can type on a keyboard, it records it meticulously, and then I say to the computer, so what does that all mean? And they say, I don't understand the question. I mean, that's a much harder question. So you go through your day and you do things and you see things and your brain records them. You're driving to work. You saw some jerk cross the street with a red light. And you record that. And actually, if you think about it now, you can sort of remember him crossing the road. And is that something you want to keep? Is there something about that you need to know? If you're going to store that, how do you want to file it? Do you file it under jerks? Or do you file it under traffic accidents? So it turns out that that's the hard part. In fact, it might be the most sophisticated thing that the human brain does, is to take the events of our days, the memories that we form, and decide what they mean to us, how they should affect us in the future going forward.
So we're processing all this, putting the information together that we've gathered during the day. So you're focusing right away on like a mental function. I mean, I know there are also, you've talked about other kinds of housekeeping kind of functions that aren't about information processing so far, even if some of them are about maintaining the brain's physical health. They're still not about.
So there's a distinction between what are the functions, multiple, of sleep today, and why did it originally evolve. So for example, if you work in a tall office building, the cleaning staff comes at night and cleans. Why do they come at night? Well, it's not because night is inherently a better time to clean, but since the workers are all gone, that makes it a useful time to do it. Mm-hmm. So we release as children and adolescents something like 80% of our growth hormone during slow wave sleep during the night. Not when we're awake, not in other stages of sleep. And, you know, it's almost as if the brain says, okay, if I'm going to pick a time of day for this person's body to work on growth, I don't want it to be a period of time when they're going to be leaping up and running around and doing things, because that's going to kind of get in the way. The body's just asleep now. Why don't I take advantage of this time to work on immune function? Mm-hmm. So it's sort of, once you've evolved sleep for whatever its core reason was, then you just glom on all sorts of other functions that just make sense to do during the downstage.
Okay, so you're suggesting that the sleep initially evolved, and we're going way back in the lineage, way back before mammals, but the sleep initially evolved to handle the information processing, the kind of consolidation and synthesis and so on of information. And then once animals were sleeping, it turned out that various kinds of housekeeping were better done at that time, which it kind of answers a question I had, which is like, okay, let's assume that you need to be, you know, kind of lie down to let your body do a lot of things, but why lose consciousness? That seems like a high price to pay, because when you're not conscious, like, animals can sneak up and eat you and stuff. So that's a real cost in evolutionary terms. And I guess your suggestion is there's something about the nature of the information processing that would be impeded by continued conscious awareness.
Yes. So nowadays, with our VCRs and with our other electronic devices, we can watch one TV show on our screen and be recording another one in the background, right? Mm-hmm. We can't do that in our brains. So I've been watching you about 100 times now. You've gone like this.
Have I?
Yeah. You're thinking about something. Mm-hmm. And in order to
I just did it. Go ahead.
Now you're in trouble. Now you're going to miss. So when you want to think about something internally,
we should say for our listeners that you what you said is that I've kind of looked up and to the left with my eyes the way people do when they're pondering something. So
right.
Go ahead.
So what you're doing is you're cutting off your normal visual input. I mean, and in fact, sometimes you'll be trying to think about something and the other person keeps talking, and if they're really good friends, say, wait, just shut up. Okay, let me think about this for a minute.
If they're good friends or your spouse, yes.
That's right. And so what that says is, I'm sorry, I can't keep processing what you're saying and think about this thing at the same time. So the studies that have been done with waking people is that about a third of the time you're awake, you're not thinking about what you're doing. Now, that doesn't mean it's completely unrelated. It's not like you're sitting in a lecture and you're thinking about going to a movie with your friend tonight. It means that you're thinking about what someone just said 5 seconds ago, and you're saying, wait a minute, didn't somebody else say, that's confusing? And so even when we're awake, we have to keep turning off to process what's just come in so that we can keep going even in the moment. And it turns out, evolutionarily, I think, that the rubric that works for humans is about a third of the time should be taken for that kind of dedicated offline processing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, so you've done work suggesting that and we can get to some of the physiological functions. I mean the housekeeping functions later, because those have implications for things like whether too little sleep could leave you more disposed to getting Alzheimer's down the road and so on. But I'd like to get a little into dreams first. There's a separate question that I presume is related to the question why we sleep. But why do we dream? You can imagine just sleeping and not dreaming, but have we started to put together the pieces here? I mean, in other words, do your ideas about the kind of information processing that gets done do those shed any light like on the nature of our dreams and the sometimes weird structure of our dreams?
It's hinting at it.
Uh-huh.
Okay? So there's a very nasty sort of conundrum in this question, because you're asking about why we dream in the sense of having these conscious or these altered consciousness experiences, of experiencing a dream.
Mm-hmm.
And so you might be asking the question, why can't the brain do, let's say, I'm going to tell you about studies that suggest that dreaming, in fact, is a reflection of aspects of this memory processing that goes on during sleep. Now, you could ask me, oh, that's really cool. What kind of memory processing functions are related to dreaming? And I can give you, I think, good information about that. But then you could say, so why do I have to dream it? Why can't my brain just do it while I'm totally unaware?
Right.
And that brings us into the problem of consciousness in general.
Right.
I mean, there are no good answers to the questions of why do we have to be conscious, period. I mean, there aren't any. I mean, it turns out that we do evolutionarily, but there is nothing inherently obvious about consciousness that gives us an advantage that we couldn't have had anyways.
Right.
So, you know, there's a startling fact that there has never been a scientific experiment demonstrating that humans are conscious.
Well, there can't be, because it's a private thing, right? I mean,
that's the excuse we give.
Yeah.
Right?
But I mean, scientifically, for something to be scientific data, it has to be publicly observable, and all that's publicly observable is that a bunch of people claim they are conscious. I can't verify that in a way that I can demonstrate to other observers that they're conscious.
Right, unless you really, really clearly understood the entire physiological, neurochemical, electrical basis of that consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
So then you could say, well, look, if you wire a system up like this in the brain, it's going to produce consciousness. I mean, we know that. If you stimulate these cells in the retina, it's going to cause these cells in the lateral geniculate nucleus to fire. Now, I don't know how close we are to that kind of an explanation, and there is this argument that you can never get there. But I'm not convinced that that argument is philosophically sound. For the time being, we don't have a clue. I've got a half-finished manuscript entitled "We Don't Know Jack About Consciousness." I mean, we don't have a clue of even how to begin thinking about looking for that physiological mechanism, even though we all believe that it's there.
Yeah.
So that's why when you ask me, why do we need to dream? All I can answer is, bad question.
Okay. But I mean, what's fascinating about dreaming as far as consciousness goes is when you wake up in the middle of the dream, it seems as if there was conscious awareness, there was consciousness of the dream, and yet if you hadn't woken up, you would never be able to recall it. So it's almost as if, like, the consciousness is required to be a part of the constructive information processing, but since consciousness is maybe in some sense a finite resource, it has to be, like, taken away from you, or kind of, and used. The resource of consciousness has to be redeployed or something. You know, it's weird. Well,
so you're conflating a couple things.
Okay.
Well, one has to do with remembering dreams when you wake up, and how if you wake up and don't remember a dream, it's not obvious that you had been dreaming at all.
Mm-hmm.
But I've driven places and arrived at the wrong place. You know, I moved to a new house 5 blocks from where I used to live. I drive home, and I suddenly find myself pulling into the old driveway. Mm-hmm. And I say, I must not have been conscious of what I was doing. But I'm pretty convinced that when I turned the corners, I was conscious, or I wouldn't be able to turn a corner. Mm-hmm. Okay? In the strongest example of that, I used to commute down the Massachusetts Turnpike and then go off and down a parallel road for 5 miles to where I was working at the time. And I suddenly came to an overpass that I had to go under and realized that I had missed my exit from the turnpike. Mm-hmm. And went onto the ramp to get onto that exit at this later point, and then realized, oh no, I was off the turnpike already.
Yeah.
And I suddenly realized, I had stopped at a toll booth, I'd gotten out money, I'd paid the guy, I'd gotten my change, I'd put the change away, I'd driven down the road, driven another 3 miles, and had zero memory of it.
You were probably thinking about something else at the time, right? Your consciousness was absorbed in something else. I mean, if he had pulled out a gun, you would have noticed that you were monitoring at some level the situation. But
right. But the fact that when I got down the road, I had no memory of it.
Right. I know.
Doesn't say to me that I was unconscious.
Doesn't say you were totally unconscious, time. Right? So
that's the conflation between memory,
right,
and the occurrence of it.
No, I'm conceding there's a kind of consciousness while you're dreaming. It's just that the you that wakes up tomorrow doesn't have conscious access to it.
That's right. That's right.
So tell us some of the work you or others have done that suggest functionality in dreaming.
Well, probably the nicest study is one that a fellow in my lab, Erin Walmsley, did, where she basically took one of our paradigms where we see sleep-dependent memory enhancement, and we're sort of jumping ahead of ourselves in a way. So let me just give the one sentence that says that while we're sleeping, through all the different stages of sleep, we now have excellent data showing from dozens of labs around the world that the brain is continually working on the information that we've taken in during the day. It's stabilizing memories, it's enhancing memories, it's integrating new memories with old memories. It's taking emotional memories and throwing out the unemotional parts and just keeping the emotional core of the event. Mm-hmm. It's taking complex events and extracting the gist of something that happened and forget the details. It's extracting patterns that weren't obvious to us when we were awake in the information. So it's doing all of these things. And so Erin took one of those paradigms where you're basically having a subject sit at a computer and navigating through a maze on the screen, a 3D maze on the screen, and trying to learn the layout of the maze. And first she showed that if you do this and then retest them 3 hours later, they don't remember it as well as they did right at the end of training. But if you let them nap for an hour and a half in the middle of those 3 hours, then they actually have a better memory of the maze than at the end of training. So like everything I was just talking about, the sleep appears to enhance the memory that you formed before you went to sleep. Okay. And then Erin asked the question you're asking. So what does that have to do with dreaming? Well, if she wakes people up at various times during that nap and says, tell me what you were dreaming about, and then lets them go back to sleep. She does this 3 times during the nap, and then she takes those reports and she gives them to 2 or 3 or 4 of us and says, tell us if this is a dream that had to do with the maze task. And then she takes all of those instances where at least 2 out of the 3 of us said, yeah, this is related to the maze task. And it turns out that, lo and behold, it's the people who have those in their dreams who show the bulk of the improvement after their nap. So if you dream about it, you're going to show greater improvement than if you don't.
You know, I think I heard on Radiolab, although I may have just dreamed this, you tell me, about a study involving rats and dreams and maze running. Does that ring a bell at all?
Yep. I was on the same show.
Okay, good.
That was Matt Wilson's work. And Matt says something very cautious. He says, if the rats were dreaming, I knew what they were dreaming about. So what he shows is that patterns of activity in the brain at the single cell level, which can show you as a rat moves through a maze, the hippocampus, which is a structure sort of deep in the middle of the brain that's involved with memory, the hippocampus takes individual cells and says, this cell in my hippocampus correlates to this place in the maze. And every time the rat walks through that place, I'm going to go. Okay. So he can, in fact, look at the firing of 50 of these cells without looking at this video camera and tell you how the rat is progressing through the maze by the order in which those cells are firing. It's in essence as if he's got a bunch of video cameras
right
along a path, and when the person shows up in this camera, he says, oh, that means they're getting close to the door.
And what I thought I remembered him saying is that, like, did he monitor the brains while they were dreaming? And
nope.
No,
while they were sleeping.
While they were sleeping. Okay,
he's not. He saw the cells firing in the pattern indicative of them walking through the maze.
And I thought I remembered one further thing, which is that when he walked them through two different, very distinctively different mazes, the pattern of sleep suggested they were integrating fragments of memory from one maze with fragments. They were mixing and matching.
Sometimes they do that, yes.
And that's interesting because it gets back to my question about the quality of my dreams. There's a lot of seemingly random juxtaposition. In other words, like, you know, in the end, it kind of seems like a coherent story, but you have to strain to make the dream seem like one. At least my dreams. It's like, wait a second, I was at a service station, then I was in a bowling alley, and so all of a sudden, and you go, oh, but then I looked around in the bowling alley, and the same person who was with me at the service station was there, so yeah, it's kind of connected. But I mean, the fact is, there seems to be a lot of random juxtaposition.
Yes.
And is that possibly related to your idea about what kind of learning and consolidation we do?
So I would not say random. Mm-hmm. I would say unpredictable, which is more like chaotic than random. And the difference between those.
In other words, there may be an underlying logic why particular things were juxtaposed. It's just not obvious.
It's not obvious, and you would never have predicted it. So you know, you think back and you say, oh, you know what? Last time I went bowling, I just realized that I got halfway there and realized that my tank was on empty.
That's good.
And I had to stop and get gas.
That's good.
Now, you might not remember that.
Right.
In which case, it just looks like a random juxtaposition.
Right.
It might have been you were driving to the bowling alley and you checked your gas gauge and it was fine. And so the question is, what is your brain trying to do while you're sleeping and while you're dreaming? Mm-hmm. And one of the critical things it's trying to do, and frankly we spend our whole lives doing this, is trying to figure out what fits together. What's a coincidence? What's really important? What makes sense? What doesn't? Mm-hmm. Here's an example. Trump just banned all travel from people from 7 Arab nations, none of which have ever sent someone to the U.S. who caused a terrorist attack with a death. 2 Muslim nations, Saudi Arabia and Egypt, that are responsible for 98% of all terrorist deaths in the U.S., were not amongst the nations who were banned. And those are the only 2 of the 9 where Trump has investments. Now, coincidence? Part of his decision process? We can't answer that question. Not even clear that he can. But if you're sleeping, your brain would want to bring those sorts of things together and say, does it make sense to put the bowling alley up against the gas filling station? I mean, is putting that hose into your tank sort of like getting the ball to go down the... I mean, why did your brain choose to put those together? Right. A lot of the times it's probably gibberish. I sort of think of dreaming as being sort of like a venture capitalist. A venture capitalist, if they're getting 30% of their investments being profitable, that's a bad sign.
Right.
They only want 5 to 10% to be profitable.
But they want them to be big time profitable.
Right. So for the things that are 30% profitable, I think those we can process when we're awake. We can process them during other stages of sleep. What REM dreaming in particular seems to be about is taking really faint associations that you have and putting them together And it's almost like an improv class. Okay? You're in an improv class and they say, okay, do something about buying gasoline at a bowling alley. And you think about it and you say, buying gasoline? Okay, I can do that.
Yeah.
Right? And then you put a story together. So I think what's happening is that the brain is, as one of its functions during sleep, is to search for weakly associated memories which individually carry some weight, and try to see if there's a reason that they should be bound together.
Yeah.
So think about what creativity is, right? Creativity is about taking facts that you already have and suddenly realizing that if you take your two hands, you can't get them to lie on top of each other, unless you do it this way. And you suddenly see a way that they fit together that you didn't see before. That's what creativity is about. It's finding a novel, it's finding new information from old.
Yeah.
And to be really creative, to be an aha as opposed to a duh, they have to be non-obvious associations.
Well, that's what's interesting. And I think it's like I can often, when I have a dream and think about it, I can often connect elements of it to something I did the day before or did recently or a concern I had recently, but sometimes it's not obvious. It's not exactly the same thing. It's like I'm extracting some property from the experience I had. Like this was a big navigational challenge, but in the dream it's on the ocean instead of on the street or something. You know, so you extract these properties, and I assume, I mean, this may explain why Freud was so convinced that these were deeply symbolic in a particular way, right? Because as you said, there's often a non-obvious connection to the actual raw material of the dream, right?
So let me tell you about a paper we published 15 years ago now.
Okay.
Where we had subjects write down their dreams when they woke up in the morning, and then go through and underline all the parts of their dreams where they think they know why that was in the dream. Not to explain the whole dream, but this person's in the dream because I saw them yesterday for the first time in a month. And, the cat was in the dream because my cat got out, whatever. And so we had them underline it and then write down what was the waking event that they think was the cause of this appearing in the dream. And then we asked them on a scale of 1 to 5, the dream event and the waking event, how similar were they in terms of characters, objects, actions, location, themes, emotions? And only the themes and emotions overlapped. So I'm driving home from work one day and some car comes flying through a stop sign and almost crashes into me. I have to do that thing where I weave into oncoming traffic hoping that there's no one there and then cut back in. And there was no one there and nothing happens and it was all fine. And I get home and I tell Debbie, my wife, we're moving to Iowa. I can't take Boston driving anymore. That night I have a dream. In the dream, I'm at an amusement park with my 10-year-old son, Adam, and we're on the bumper cars. And he's driving around crashing into everybody, and everybody's crashing into us. And I usually love bumper cars, but this time in my dream, I'm saying, I don't like this. I don't want to be here. I want to get out of here. I just don't want to be here. I wake up from the dream, and I laugh, and I say, oh, God, I just had a dream about that near-miss accident I had today driving home. But my dream isn't in a car.
Right.
I don't dream the memory. When I wake up, the memory of the car coming through the stop sign is very clear. I don't dream that memory. I don't even say in my dream, this is like that accident I almost had. I'm just dreaming about being in bumper cars. But it's so obvious that was engendered by. So here's what I say happened. My brain said, wow, Stickgold, you almost got killed there today. What is that? my therapist, what does that bring up for you? And I say, sort of like being on bumper cars. I mean, I never thought about it, but so why does the brain, so what do I get out of it? Maybe I get nothing. Maybe I get out of it, bumper cars are safe and driving on the street isn't. Maybe I get out of it, I got crashed into 50 times in the bumper cars and nothing happened. Now that I think about it, I didn't almost get killed. I almost got a stupid insurance claim. I mean, he was going to hit my passenger seat door. There was no one in the passenger seat. He wasn't moving at high speed. Mm-hmm. It wasn't actually as dangerous as I came home thinking it was. Maybe I'm safer than I thought I was when I went to bed.
So in that scenario, the output, the practical import of the dream would be to keep you from freaking out next time you get into a car?
It would be to have that association available to me next time I get into a car.
So and provide some measure of reassurance.
Yeah.
And it is, that would be a rational reading of the situation, because the truth is it was a freak thing and it's probably not going to happen again, and you really shouldn't worry overly much.
Overly much.
Right. Of course, so many dreams seem devoted to getting you to worry. It's like, and of course sometimes worry is rational, but of course we all have these classic anxiety dreams that you're at school and you haven't studied for the exam, and they may show up when you actually do face some deadline in real life. Do you think that those things are more kind of straightforward, or what? Is there something? Is that a particular genre of function, or?
To have them be anxious?
Yeah, to have them be seem plausibly interpretable as warnings that you better focus on this thing that lies ahead, or you're going to be in trouble.
I think the function of those dreams is to ask you the question: is this something that you should be focused on and paying attention to, so that you don't get into trouble in the future? And I think sometimes we have what we refer to in the field as big dreams. In the 60s, as I was an anti-war protester, and I had these dreams about being chased by police, which was probably because when I was awake, I was being chased by police, anxiety dream, maybe just reliving it kind of, although never the actual replay, until one time I have the dream and this cop chases me down into the basement of the lab where I work, and he comes right up to me and I realize it's my father. And I say in the dream, "This is stupid," and wake up. And I stop having the dreams. Now, I don't know what to say about it. Maybe there was a conflation in my memory associations between the police and their actions against them and my relationship with my father, which was not terrible in any way, but, he
was an authority figure. There's a natural, yeah.
And maybe as I was sleeping, my brain was saying, what are you really worried about in these situations? I mean, is there are you worrying about?
Well, I mean, here's if you want to lie down on a couch while I give you my interpretation, feel free. I'll send you the bill later. Could it be that, you're testing the hypothesis of whether in protesting the war and being anti-authority in this way, you are violating the values that your father imbued in you, right? I mean, that is a kind of
continuing the fights I had with my father, am I replaying my struggles over differentiation with my father now with the police?
So you're kind of sounding a little.
Don't say Freudian.
That's exactly what I was going to say, and the reason I was going to say it is because the bulk of what you've been saying about dreams suggests that you think Freud was kind of misconstruing the situation. In other words, we've given lots of reasons why dreams would have a texture that makes it seem like part of your brain is cloaking the import, concealing the import of them, you know, because it takes, again, it changes the context, and it does these various things to make their raw material non-obvious. So you can see why Freud would be able to, like, do this symbolic interpretation and conclude that they are being cloaked to protect your conscious mind from something, and we have to get to the bottom of this. I assume you actually reject the bulk of Freud's apparatus here.
I was famously quoted once as saying that I thought Freud was 50% right and 100% wrong.
What's the 50% right?
Well, the 50% right is about a lot of his observations about dreams, that they tend to include what he calls day residue, aspects of events from our day, and that we then tend to relate those to what appear to be older memories, and sort of build this novel structure, this dream, which has bits of yesterday and bits of a year ago, or bits of yesterday and bits of the day before yesterday, putting them together in novel, unobvious ways. I think that that's all true. I don't think they were all about repressed memories or sexuality. I mean, I think they can be. There's a guy in Sweden, Dijksterhuis, who thinks that they're all about threat avoidance. He works with refugees from war areas that are dealing with trauma all the time. I think it does both of those things, but I think they're both fundamentally wrong in thinking that that's what dreaming is about. Here's a simple model. I think when we dream, I think our brain keeps a record of incomplete processes that it has started. They can be as simple as deciding which movie to go to on the weekend, or which person to marry, or which job to take, or whether to go to college at all or not, or how to deal with your relationship with your mother. They can be any of these things. If they're still incomplete, if they haven't reached a conclusion that's satisfying and closes the issue, the brain keeps a tag on it. And when you dream, when you sleep, even more than when you dream, but especially when you dream, your brain goes through and it grabs tagged items. So you don't dream about emotionally important issues in your past that are settled. Okay? If you're planning your marriage, you have all these horrible dreams about what can go wrong with the wedding. If you've been happily married for 5 years, you don't have those dreams anymore. That's done, that's finished. You know, if things happen then at the wedding that you're still struggling with, like maybe you shouldn't have given such a big hug and kiss to your old girlfriend, and maybe your wife's still really pissed about it 5 years later, then you still dream about it. But it's because your brain says, this continues to need processing. So it takes things that have flags of importance and incompleteness, and it brings them up and it says, okay, what can I do new with this? And so it goes and finds new things to associate it with. Now, part of the way the brain does this cleverly during REM sleep is it shuts off the neural pathways in your brain that allow you to recall episodic memories. So Freud might say, or in my example, you might say, so how come, Bob, when you were having that dream about the bumper cars, why didn't you remember in your dream the accident you almost had? But it's because the outflow from the hippocampus to the cortex through the perforant pathway is shut down during REM sleep. And that means it's impossible for your brain to reactivate a recently formed episodic memory.
But some of the material from that memory got into the dream.
Yes, because the information is actually stored in the cortex as sort of disparate pieces of sort of generic information.
So like near miss, you know, that was close call.
Near miss.
The sense of a close call, a collision.
Right. Guy wearing a Red Sox cap. You know, so maybe you end up crashing into people at a ball game because the guy in the car. If you saw Schindler's List,
Yeah, a long time ago.
The whole movie's in black and white, except there's one girl walking down the street in a red coat, and her coat's in red. And it's like that detail of the memory got saved because the brain didn't understand it. Mm-hmm. I think the reason people with PTSD have these dreams over years and years where they just replay the traumatic event in the exact same form is because they haven't been able to process it yet. Mm-hmm. And so it sits there in the raw form.
Mm-hmm. Okay, one more question about dreams before we move to just other functions of sleep. It is interesting that, well, actually maybe two quick questions. I mean, one question is, it's always tempting when I remember a dream to like try to interpret it, like in a kind of Freudian way. It's like, this seems to be a message. It has the hallmarks of a message being sent to me, and if I can interpret it, it's like my inner self giving me guidance, and so I kind of enjoy trying to do that. But if really the juxtaposition of the elements was just a kind of hypothesis testing in a sense, in other words, it if not, though not random, it also wasn't
destined.
Yeah, so it's a mistake. There is meaning to the juxtaposition, but you would think it's a mistake to think that it's always easy to say my inner self is trying to encourage me to do this particular thing, because it's basically the juxtaposition of things is in a certain sense the testing of a hypothesis, not a finished plot that your inner self is willing to stand behind. So
that's right. And if you think about plays, if you think about drama, if you think about Greek plays, I mean, they're not about the people in the situations that you're watching. They're about bigger conceptual questions, mm-hmm. right? I mean, it's about the responsibility to family. It's about this or that. And they've made a story so they could show it to you. So it might be that even what the dream is about has nothing to do particularly with the juxtaposed items. It was like, well, how can I talk about this concept of moral obligation? I can't have a dream where I just see morals floating around and smiling at each other and saying hi. I got to tell a story that exemplifies it. And so the exact example needn't be important. I mean, I think interpreting your own dreams is a delightful pastime.
It is fun.
I think it can give you actual insights.
Yeah.
I tell people, never marry someone because of a dream and never divorce someone because of a dream. But those dreams are relevant to the process, right? And mm-hmm. so you can pay attention as long as you don't overinterpret them, as mm-hmm. long as you don't imbibe them mm-hmm. with more accuracy. I mean, the classic example, you have a dream where you sleep with someone from work who is like the least attractive person in the office. And you sort of, in the dream, it's usually like, why am I sleeping with this guy or this gal? I mean, well, that's kind of weird. But then you wake up and you go, yuck, what is my brain? I don't want to sleep. No. And so the point is, you're right. No, that's the answer. Your brain asked you a question. This is someone who you would normally not pay any attention to. What would happen if you actually got together with them and you wake up and you say, it would be a disaster? No. So again, the hypothesis testing can lead to an answer that's absolutely contrary to what's presented. And it's useful information. So I would say to people, enjoy interpreting your dreams, take advantage of insights that you gain, and don't base your decisions on them.
Yeah.
It's just more information, more gist for the mill.
Okay, so, the subject of dreams has been so interesting that we've gone on a little longer about that than I had anticipated. And I promised to get to some questions about the function of sleep proper without leave dreams aside, including some kind of maintenance functions. And, again, well, I guess you've kind of answered the question. Why would maintenance functions need sleep in order to get done. And it isn't that they quite need sleep. It's just that we evolved sleep, and then that turns out to be a good time to do housekeeping generally. And one piece of housekeeping has to do with this protein whose accumulation has been correlated with Alzheimer's, right? And that gets like swept away during sleep or something. How does that go?
Yeah, it turns out it's not just that one protein, but that while you sleep, the cells actually shrink in size a little bit. And this opens up more space between the cells. And this allows for the cerebrospinal fluid to wash through them better and wash out all sorts of waste products that have been dumped out of the cells and into the intercellular space. And the paper that you're referring to was brilliantly done. They chose to demonstrate this by using a protein that's involved in Alzheimer's disease, injecting it in and showing that it washes out faster. They could have actually used any protein they wanted. They could have used albumin from an egg or something, but they used those proteins that are involved in Alzheimer's. And so it does seem likely that while you're sleeping, these are going to tend to get washed out better.
So at least somewhat faster than they do during waking.
Right. Is that enough to make a difference?
So nobody's looked at correlational studies with like how much sleep people got and whether they got Alzheimer's later or anything like that?
Not that I know.
Not that you know. And are there any other like diseases that are implicated that could be related to not enough sleep? I mean, let's leave aside for the moment psychiatric disorders. Are there any others?
None that come to mind right off. A lot of psychiatric conditions now where it's become very clear. We used to always think that the sleep disruption associated with psychiatric disorders was secondary to the disorders. And now there's examples with a bunch of different disorders, from PTSD to ADHD to depression to schizophrenia to bipolar disorder, where we can show clear causal pathways from the sleep disruption to the development or enhancement, the worsening of symptomatology. For other diseases, I don't think none come to mind.
So the common sense interpretation of correlations between psychiatric disorders and lack of sleep might have been that it's all about the disorder leading to the lack of sleep. But you think that to at least some extent, in at least some of these cases, it works in the other direction.
So if you have patients who have both major clinical major depression, and also have sleep apnea, on average, if you treat the sleep apnea, you can get recovery from the depression so that they no longer meet the standards for clinical depression. With kids, you see the apnea being associated with ADHD. And then in those cases, there are studies that say if you treat the sleep apnea in those kids, you get a bigger reduction in ADHD symptoms than if you put the kid on Ritalin. Okay, so again, the sleep disorder seems to be driving the other. Bipolar disorder, if you sleep deprive people with bipolar disorder, you tend to push them over into mania. One of the genes that's been shown to be associated with schizophrenia is known to code for a protein that is involved in producing one of the signature events during sleep in the EEG involved with memory processing. So if you have a disruption of that gene in schizophrenia, you have less sleep-dependent memory processing, and you have increased positive symptoms. So in all of these ways, there seem to be causal arrows going from the sleep disruption to the psychiatric disorder. Now, in all those cases, it's probably bidirectional. So it's sort of a positive feedback loop. But there's really good, experimental data now saying that there's an arrow that goes from the sleep disruption to the triggering of, the enhancement of, or even the causing of the psychiatric disorder.
And even if we're not pushed over the edge into a like bona fide, officially diagnosable psychiatric disorder, it's possible that lack of sleep is just keeping us from being psychologically optimal. I mean, we might have more sadness, more anxiety, whatever, right?
So Matt Walker, who's at Berkeley now, has a wonderful study that shows if you sleep-deprive people and for one night, and then test them 2 days later after 2 nights of recovery sleep for words that they were exposed to when they were sleep-deprived, compared to people who had slept the night before they were exposed to the words, they have a twofold bias for remembering negative words as opposed to positive words.
Whoa, that's interesting.
So normally, if a client comes into a doctor and says, my wife says I have to come and see you, she says, all I remember are the bad things that happened. Doctor's likely to say, well, it sounds like you're depressed. But it also sounds like they're sleep deprived. So it might not push you into clinical depression. These were just normal, healthy college students. But what they remembered 2 days later was all of the bad stuff and only half of the good stuff.
So how do we go about, I mean, all of this suggests that it's in our interest to figure out whether we're not getting enough sleep. But how do we figure out what's not enough? Because I assume that different people, I don't even know how you'd establish it, but it's always been my intuition that different people just need different amounts of sleep. I have 2 daughters who seem to need very different amounts of sleep if you judge by just how much sleep they get before they feel it's time to wake up.
Right. So there's an answer and there's a caveat. What I'm going to tell you is how to figure out how much sleep you need to meet what your body is trying to get. Okay? But it's going to be a little bit like saying that how much you should eat. Well, you should just eat as much as you want. Now, we know that's not very good for Americans, right? That if we just ate as much as we wanted, we double the obesity rate. But we know biologically, if you're putting on weight, you're eating too much. If you're at a proper weight and gaining weight, you're eating too much. If you're obese, you're eating too much. So we have an outcome measure that we can use other than, are you hungry? Now, my mother always used to say, you hungry? You're hungry? I'll give you more food. You know, that's not a good recipe for health. But for sleep, that's what we go on. So here's my triad, okay? If you are unapproachable until you've had a cup of coffee in the morning, you're not getting enough sleep. If you sleep an hour or more longer on the weekends than you do during the week, you're not getting enough sleep. If the idea of living a life without an alarm clock is farcical to you, then you're not getting enough sleep.
You mean farcical in the sense that there's no way you'd wake up at the time you're setting your alarm for?
That's right. You know that your body, given the choice, would not wake up that early. Now, if you go to work at 11, that would seem very reasonable to you. Sure, I'm going to wake up by 11.
Yeah.
But if you say, my alarm clock is set for 7:30, if I didn't set it for 7:30, I'd probably sleep till 10, you're not getting enough sleep.
I get about 6 hours and 6.5 to 6 3/4 hours a night. And I think there's maybe 2 reasons for this, that I've chosen this. I mean, I set my alarm for that. And one is that when I was about 12, I read Willie Mays' autobiography, and he said that if you sleep longer than 7 hours, you'll get lazy. So maybe I took that to heart. But it's also a fact, I think, that if I sleep longer than 7 hours, I feel a little headachy, and I mean, maybe that's just me, having read his Mays' autobiography, kind of imagining that. But I genuinely feel like I'm more just alert and ready to go after 6 hours and 45 minutes of sleep than after 7.5 hours of sleep.
So there's a very real question there that has not been addressed. Now, the usual form is, I had to finish a paper. I only got 2 hours of sleep Monday night. And I felt pretty decent on Tuesday.
Yeah.
Then Tuesday night, I slept 11 hours and I was a wreck.
Yeah.
And it's unclear in cases like that whether you're just finally seeing, you still haven't gotten the first day, you were just jagged up on inadequate sleep. And by the second day, you're really feeling the effects of it. So I think that's some of it. But there's also this thing around sleeping too much, leaving you sort of hungover the next day.
Yeah, yeah.
And I don't have anything to say about that. I don't have an explanation for why it would happen. I don't have an explanation for... I don't have an understanding of what's actually happening. I don't know if it's just when you wake up that it takes you about a half hour longer to feel fully awake, and that might be because you've sort of sunk back into deeper sleep before you woke up, or whether it's sort of something that hangs on during the day. I don't think we even have that data.
Mm-hmm. And for people who have trouble sleeping, which seems to become more of a problem as you get older, there are various sleeping aids. I think it's not hard for most people to find one that works, or at least find one that if you take enough of it, it works. But two things, I mean, in my experience, they leave me super hungover. And at least the standard kind of Ambien, it's a lower level of functioning for me than just not getting enough sleep. And also, you just wonder, I mean, we've talked a lot about this kind of information processing that needs to get done. And do we have any idea whether some of these are impeding that, or? Well,
interestingly, none of the drug companies have asked us to do studies.
Isn't that curious that they're not more curious?
Well, or else they're afraid they know what the answer is.
Yeah.
Right? So here's what we know. A lot of the sleep-dependent memory processing that goes on happens particularly during deep sleep, what we call slow-wave sleep, because of what the EEG looks like. You see these big slow waves in it. And almost all of the sleeping meds reduces the amount of slow-wave sleep you get. Most of them also reduce the amount of REM sleep you get, leaving you with lots and lots of this lighter stage of non-REM sleep. So those things probably are impairing sleep-dependent memory processing. The other thing to know is none of these meds in the big clinical trials give you much more than an extra half hour of sleep.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a huge benefit. It helps you fall asleep faster.
Yeah, it's just more pleasant.
Yeah, and with Ambien, even if you don't fall asleep faster, it causes a retrograde amnesia, so you think you fell asleep faster.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. So with Ambien, you can be lying in bed, think, for an hour and a half falling asleep, and you wake up the next morning and you say, wow, I fell asleep in 15 minutes.
Yeah.
And if you're unlucky, your wife turns to you and say, you think you fell asleep in 15 minutes? You don't remember our making love? And this is a common complaint about some of these drugs.
Yeah.
That's what they all say. Don't take them until you're ready to actually go to sleep.
Okay. I avoid them in general. Now, what about something that is seems more natural, like melatonin, which is something that naturally occurs in our body, unlike Ambien?
So it's much safer, but it doesn't have that much of an effect. The best thing...
It does on me. Melatonin will knock me out.
Okay.
So you would recommend it over the synthetic?
Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. But the best thing, it turns out, is what's called cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia.
Right.
Which is basically learning little tricks. Little tricks like go to bed at the same time every night, really. Don't go to bed 2 hours later on the weekend and sleep 2 hours later, because when you do that, you induce jet lag. It's the same as if you moved from Boston to Denver, because now you're going to bed on Denver time, getting up on Denver time, and over 2 days in Denver, your body adjusts to Denver time. Then Monday comes along, and Sunday night you don't want to go to bed because it's still 2 hours earlier in Denver. And Monday morning, you can't get out of bed because it's 2 hours earlier. So that's an example. It's also known as sleep hygiene. It's just like good sleep practices. Get off your computer at least a half hour to an hour before you go to bed. Don't watch television in bed. Don't do these things that confuse you about what you're supposed to be doing. So there's a nice little list of them. You can just Google sleep hygiene,
yeah,
and you'll get this list. And you can take, a short sequence of classes in it, and it works. And it lasts for 6 months follow-up, 1 year follow-up.
Okay.
It's just learning how to do it better.
I find if I eat a little pasta before bed, it actually makes it easier to go to sleep. But I think that then when the carbs like wear off, like 3-4 hours into it, I'm actually more inclined to wake up feeling a little unsettled.
So that's very possible. I mean, that's the alcohol story in spades. I mean, people take alcohol because it does help them fall asleep. It also suppresses REM sleep, which is a problem. But then what happens in the second half of the night, they're waking up every half hour. So sometimes you get sort of these rebounds if you do these sorts of interventions. On the other hand, a hot bath a half hour before you go to bed.
Yeah.
Raise your core body temperature a little bit. That helps you fall and stay asleep.
Okay, final question. Speaking of waking up in the middle of the night, as you get older, I think you're more inclined to find yourself, waking up 2 hours before you'd planned to. And sometimes you're beset by anxiety and worry and disaster scenarios or guilt, things you've done horribly wrong. And the interesting thing about these is, well, two interesting things. In the light of day, the next day, these things are not going to seem as grave. Moreover, at a conscious level, you know that. You can tell yourself that, and yet it doesn't help much. So I guess I have, well, one question is, do you think this is, in any sense, functional, or it's just something that, and secondly, do you have any advice?
Yeah, so first of all, I think it's functional in a very different way. I mean, the example I always give is waking up at 3 in the morning and suddenly saying, did I turn my headlights off? Oh God, I don't remember turning my headlights off. I can actually remember turning the radio off, turning the key, taking it out, and I must have taken it out because I got into the house. But did I turn off the headlights? If I don't, I'm going to have a dead battery. I can lie in bed for a half hour replaying and replaying that scenario with greater and greater anxiety, and never once think to roll over, lift up the shade, look down the driveway and see if my headlights are on.
That would be one approach.
I mean, it's you get stuck in this non-progressive rumination. And I think what's going on is that in the period before you fall asleep, so you get the same thing before you go to sleep, right? All these things from the day, all these things about tomorrow sort of percolate through, hopefully in just sort of like a riffling through a file, a card file set, of yeah, there's that. I think what the brain does before you fall asleep is it tries to go through your day looking for those incomplete processes. What did I do today that I didn't finish? Well, there was that conversation with my boss who smiled and said, you're going to be into work tomorrow, right? And I said, sure. And he says, good. Why did he ask me?
Yeah, yeah.
There's something incomplete. I haven't figured out what it means. It's when you lie there and you say, oh, God, I promised him I'd send him an email. I didn't send the email. Or you say, oh, God, I have to get that paper finished tomorrow. I don't know how I'm going to find time to do it, but I really have to get it finished tomorrow. So it's almost as if your brain is asking the question, what's my task for tonight? Mm-hmm. What are my memories? What are the things that I have to work on while I'm asleep? And so it's going to go through all those things that are incomplete, that are anxious, that are worrisome because they're incomplete. So I think in that sense it's functional. Mm-hmm. But when that period, but two things can happen. It can trigger a real sort of mini panic attack. Mm-hmm. And you know this happens. You're lying there, you're almost asleep, and you say, oh God, I didn't do that. And you can feel the adrenaline rush. And then you say, oh great, now I got to lie here for 10 minutes and wait for the adrenaline to burn out of my system before I can go to sleep. Mm-hmm. So that's dysfunctional. And when it pops up at 4 o'clock in the morning, mm-hmm. I think, again, it's pretty much dysfunctional. It's the routine that the brain knows mm-hmm. for the sleep onset period. And it's just not working well.
So the kind of the anxiety, you could see. Anxiety is being attached to it in a way to get your attention, so to speak, to give it prominence. And
well, it's because it's something that you really have to deal with.
Right.
Right. So what's the solution? You asked what the solution is. You keep this little pad of paper next to your bed.
Yeah. But in a way, I could think you could almost think of the anxiety as itself a hypothesis in the sense that we don't know for sure you need to deal with it. We just don't know for sure that you don't. So it needs to be injected, and so anxiety is attached and gets your attention, even though, as you said, it's like it's unsettled. It may turn out you don't need to worry about it.
Right. It's like, well, it's like the headlights, right?
Yeah.
I mean, in fact, I had turned off the headlights. Of course, I had turned off the headlights. Why am I even worrying about this? I never remember turning off my headlights.
Right.
But this night it came up. So, it's like, did I mail that letter yesterday? Did I mail that bill back? If I didn't, it's sitting on my desk. I meant to mail it. And you can lie there and worry about it.
Yeah.
Whereas the worst case scenario is you drop it in the mail tomorrow.
Yeah.
Right? But somehow, when you're in that pre-sleep period, your brain isn't interested in solving these problems. It's only interested in lining them up. Mm-hmm. And so these things that you're exactly right. You wake up in the morning and you say, oh, right, I forgot to cancel the newspaper for when we're on vacation next week. Okay, I'll do that when I get to work. No biggie. But you lay there in bed ruminating over it because the process of it going through quickly and then falling asleep had failed.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, thank you. This has been fascinating. I could keep talking for a long time about sleep and dreams and so on. Now, is there anywhere you would direct anything you've written or a place you write stuff or any place you would direct people to go? I mean, unfortunately, your book, We Don't Know Jack About Consciousness, if I'm recalling the title correctly, is not yet completed. But
Right.
Is there anything else you direct people to?
I don't, and I'm always disappointed and a little bit sad that I have no place else to point them. And I don't think there's really good stuff out there from other people either. I think we're kind of still on our own.
Although if they Google your name, they'll find things like the Radio Lab and like various and YouTube. You're on YouTube.
Yes.
Your talks are on YouTube.
Many of them. So if they want to learn about what I've done,
right,
they can find it there.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Bob. This has been interesting, and I hope it has drained some of the anxiety out of my my nighttime awakenings.
Well, if not, sleep on it.
Okay, I'll do that.
Okay.
Take care.